banker sued a retired postal worker for $340,000, claiming a strip of land the man had bought for $47 was never legally his. What the banker didn't know was that Harold Fenwick had been waiting 23 years for exactly this moment. The lawyer called on a Tuesday. Harold Fenwick was at his kitchen table eating oatmeal when the phone rang. The man on the other end spoke fast. He said his name was Whitmore. He said he represented Meridian Capital Group. He said words like breach and vacate and $340,000, and he said them like a man who expected the person on the other end to drop the phone. Harold did not drop the phone. He set his spoon on the edge of the bowl and listened until the lawyer stopped talking. Then he said, "I'll call you back." He hung up. He pushed back from the table, walked to the bedroom closet, moved 3 coats to one side, and pulled out a green 3-ring binder. The rubber band around it had gone brittle. He snapped it off, sat back down at the kitchen table, and opened to the 3rd tab. He did not look worried. He looked like a man who had been waiting for someone to finally call. That call was February 2024. The land dispute it was about started 23 years earlier, at a folding table in the basement of the Caldwell County Administrative Building on a Thursday morning in October 2001. The county held a tax auction every 2 years. Most people didn't come. The properties on the list were the kind nobody wanted: orphan strips, drainage parcels, land the county had taxed for years without a clear owner claiming it. A coffee pot sat on a card table near the door. 4 people were in the room: a woman from the title office, 2 men Harold didn't recognize, and Douglas Reeve. Douglas Reeve was 45 and wore a watch that cost more than Harold's truck. He worked for Meridian Capital Group and had come that morning for 3 commercial lots near the highway interchange. He had a leather folder with him and had already marked the lots he intended to buy. He did not mark Parcel 7D. Nobody marked Parcel 7D. It was described in the auction sheet as a 12-foot access strip. No improvements, no structure, along the eastern edge of County Road 9. Assessed value $47. The auctioneer read it like he was apologizing for wasting everyone's time. Harold raised his card. Douglas Reeve looked over. He leaned toward the man next to him and said something Harold could not hear. Both of them laughed, not quietly. The auctioneer said sold, $47, and moved on. Harold walked to the table, paid in cash, and received a paper receipt the size of a bookmark. He folded it in half along the crease. He put it in the left pocket of his coat. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the card table. He did not look at Douglas Reeve. Douglas Reeve did not look at him either. He had already moved on to Lot 12 and was circling a number in his leather folder. Harold drank his coffee. He stood near the back wall. He watched the remaining lots go by. He said nothing to anyone. He had left before the auction ended. At home, Ruth was at the kitchen sink. She heard the door and turned. She looked at Harold. She looked at his coat pocket. She said, "Well?" He said, "Got it." She said, "47?" He said, 47. She nodded once and turned back to the sink. Harold sat at the kitchen table. He took the receipt out of his coat pocket, unfolded it, and laid it flat on the table. He read it once. He folded it again. He put it in the front of the green binder he kept in the closet. He had bought the binder that summer at an office supply store. He had paid $4 for it. He had already put 6 items inside it before the auction. The receipt was the 7th. He sat there for a while in the quiet kitchen. Outside, 12 feet of scrubby grass ran along County Road 9 like it had run there for 50 years, doing nothing, belonging to no one, going nowhere. Except Harold knew something that was not on the auction sheet. He knew something that was not in Douglas Reeve's leather folder. He knew something that nobody in that basement room had looked for, because nobody in that basement room had spent the previous 3 months in the public library reading documents nobody had touched since 1978. He closed the binder. He did not write it down yet. He just sat there in the kitchen with his coffee going cold, already certain of something that would take the rest of the world 23 years to catch up to. Before this story gets even more satisfying, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what Harold does with that $47 receipt is something no banker, no lawyer, and no boardroom saw coming. August 14, 2001. Caldwell County Public Library, 3rd floor. The reference room smelled like old paper and carpet cleaner. Harold Fenwick pulled a box off the shelf. It was labeled Road Planning Records, Eastern Corridor 1970 to 1985. The box had not been signed out since 1993. The card inside the front flap had 3 names on it. Harold added a 4th. He sat at the long table by the window and opened the box. He was not looking for anything specific that morning. He had started coming here in June, after he noticed the survey flags. There had been orange flags along the eastern edge of County Road 9, 2 miles past the grain elevator, running in a line through the tall grass. Harold had seen them from his truck. He had pulled over. He had counted 14 flags across a quarter-mile. He had written that down in the small notebook Ruth had given him for his birthday 3 years earlier. He used it for errands and to-do lists. That day he started using it for something else. He drove home and looked up who owned the land behind the flags. 8 parcels, 6 different LLCs, all registered in the same 90-day window, all purchased at below market value. Someone was assembling land along County Road 9. They were doing it quietly, through shell companies, so no single purchase looked like part of a pattern. Harold wrote the names of the LLCs in his notebook. He drew a rough line on a piece of paper showing which parcels they covered. He pinned it to the wall above the kitchen table. Ruth looked at it one evening and said, "What is that?" He said, "A map." She looked at it a moment longer. She said, "Of what?" He said, "A problem someone doesn't know they have yet." She went back to her book. That was what brought him to the library that August morning. If someone was assembling land along that corridor, there was a reason. Harold wanted to understand what the corridor was. Not what it was now, what it had been planned to be. He found it in the 3rd folder in the box. The 1974 Eastern Corridor Road Extension Plan, 52 pages. A full engineering proposal to extend County Road 9 east by 4.5 miles, connecting it to what was then a planned industrial zone. The county had approved the plan. They had acquired easements on every parcel in the path. They had broken ground on the western end then. In 1978, the industrial zone fell through. A single memo typed on county letterhead canceled the project. Budget shortfall. Indefinite postponement. Harold read the memo twice. He turned to the next page. The easement agreements had been voided in a resolution filed in November 1978. Harold found the resolution. He read the language. He stopped at line 14. The resolution listed every parcel whose easement was being released. Harold ran his finger down the list. He turned to the hand-drawn corridor map in the back of the folder and traced the route east with his finger. Parcel 7D was not on the resolution list. He checked again. The county had released every parcel except one, whether it was a clerical error, an oversight, or a filing that had been misfiled during a 1983 administrative code change. Parcel 7D, a 12-foot strip along the eastern edge of County Road 9, had never been legally released from the original 1974 corridor plan. On paper, the county's road easement through Parcel 7D was still active. Harold sat back in his chair. He looked at the window. A woman was returning books at the desk below. A kid was at the card catalog. The ceiling fan turned slowly. He pulled his notebook from his shirt pocket and wrote down the easement resolution number, the date, and the parcel numbers listed. He wrote, 7D not released. He put a box around it. Then he photographed the relevant pages with the disposable camera he had brought in his jacket pocket. He finished the roll. He took it to the 1-hour counter at the pharmacy on his way home. Back at the kitchen table that evening, Harold spread everything out, the photographs, his hand-drawn map, the list of LLCs, the notebook. Ruth set a cup of tea next to him and looked at the table. The kettle was still on the stove. The window above the sink had gone dark. She said, "Did you find what you were looking for?" he said. "More than that." She looked at the map. She looked at the photographs. She did not ask what they meant. She said, "Is it good?" He said, "It will be." She picked up her tea and went to the living room. Harold looked at the map for another 20 minutes. The LLCs had purchased 280 acres of corridor land. Some of those parcels were 40 acres. Some were 60. One was nearly 100, none of them connected to County Road 9 without crossing through 12 feet of Parcel 7D, not one. The entire assembled corridor, $2.5 million of land purchased through 6 shell companies over 90 days, had no legal road. Access without a strip of scrubby grass that Harold Fenwick had bought for $47 at a county auction, where a man in a nice watch had laughed out loud. Harold closed the notebook. He looked at the hand-drawn map one more time. The trap was already set. He just had to wait for someone to walk into it. $4,200. That was the first number the woman said when Harold opened the front door. She was young. Good posture. A clipboard in one hand and a business card in the other. She said her name was Jennifer and that she represented a land acquisition firm. She said the firm had been authorized to make Harold a fair offer on Parcel 7D. She said $4,200 was a very strong price for a 12-foot strip with no improvements. Harold looked at the clipboard. He said, "Would you like some coffee?" She said she was fine. He said, "I'll think about it." She held out the card. He took it. She smiled and walked back to her car, a silver sedan with no markings on the door. Harold watched it go. He went inside and put the card in the green binder. He kept paying the property tax, $61 a year. He paid it every March in person at the county clerk's office. He kept the receipts. He had a folder for them inside the binder with the year written on each one in blue pen. He mowed the strip twice a year, in May and again in September. He used the push mower. It took 11 minutes each time. He kept the boundary markers clear. He walked the edges after each mowing to make sure nothing had shifted. The land looked like nothing. That was fine. Harold wanted it to look like nothing. Jennifer came back in 2011 with a new number, $22,000. She stood at the same front door, different clipboard, same posture. She said the firm had revised its assessment and wanted to make a more competitive offer. She said $22,000 was nearly 500 times the original assessed value. Harold said, "I appreciate that." She said, "It's a strong offer, Mr. Fenwick," he said. "I'll think about it." She waited a moment as if he might change his mind in the next 10 seconds. He did not. She left. That evening, Ruth was at the kitchen table when Harold came in. She looked up from her crossword. She said, "How much this time?" He said, $22,000. She was quiet for a moment. She said, and he said, "No." She looked at him the way she had looked at his hand-drawn map in 2001. Not asking, not doubting, just checking that he was still the same man she had been watching all these years. She went back to her crossword. Their daughter Karen had been 12 years old in 2004 when she came home from school and found her father crouched near the edge of the property, checking the corner marker with a tape measure. She stood at the edge of the yard and watched him. She said, "Dad, what's that strip for?" He said, "Insurance." She said, "For what?" He said, "For the right moment." She had thought about that answer on and off for years without knowing what it meant. She became a property attorney. She had a practice in Charlotte. She handled title disputes and easement claims and deed challenges. She was good at her work. She didn't know yet that her father had been building her most interesting case since before she passed the bar. In 2016, the phone call came from the county. A man named Patterson from the infrastructure office called on a Wednesday afternoon. He said the county had formally approved the East Corridor Road extension plan. The first time a version of that plan had been on the books since 197. He said the county was authorized to begin voluntary acquisition of corridor parcels. He said they were prepared to offer Harold $68,000 for parcel 7D. He said the county considered that figure more than generous. Harold said, "I'm sure it is." Patterson said, "Mr. Fenwick, this road is going to be built one way or another." Harold said, "I expect so." Patterson said, "We'd prefer to do this the easy way." Harold said, "I understand." He thanked Patterson and hung up. He wrote $68,000. County declined in the notebook. He turned back to the window. Outside, the strip ran along County Road 9 the way it always had, 12 feet, quiet, exactly where he'd left it. Somewhere in a downtown office that same month, a man named Douglas Reeve sat across from two lawyers and a project manager. A map was spread across the conference table. The projected budget for the East Corridor build was on a screen behind them. One of the lawyers tapped the map at a narrow point near County Road 9 and said, "This parcel is still unresolved." Douglas Reeve said, "What does he want?" The lawyer said, "He won't say. He just says no." Douglas Reeve looked at the parcel on the map for a long moment. It was so small on the printed version that it was barely visible. A thin line, a hairline crack running across an otherwise solid acquisition. He said, "Make him a real offer." The man in the three-piece suit came in the spring of 2019. His name was Garrett. He drove a black company car and carried a leather briefcase. He called first, asked if he could come by, and showed up at 11 in the morning on a Thursday. Harold poured him coffee at the kitchen table. Garrett opened his briefcase, placed a folder on the table, and slid it across. The number on the cover page was $115,000. He said it was a final offer. He said Meridian Capital was prepared to move forward with acquisition regardless of how Harold responded, but wanted to give Harold the opportunity to settle on favorable terms. He said the company's legal team had reviewed the chain of title and had some concerns they believed would complicate Harold's position. Harold looked at the folder. He said, "I appreciate you driving out." Garrett said, "It's a significant sum." Harold said, "It is." Garrett said, "I'd encourage you to have someone look it over." Harold said, "I will." He did not open the folder. Garrett finished his coffee. He shook Harold's hand. He walked to his car and drove away without looking back. Harold took the folder, opened the binder, and placed it in the back section behind the tax receipts. He made a fresh pot of coffee. He sat at the table. The phone on the counter was quiet. Outside, it was a clear morning. The strip was green from the Maymo. The corner markers were in place. Harold sat there until the coffee was gone. A week later, the legal threat arrived by certified mail. Meridian was claiming that a digitization gap in the county's records, a 2-year break in the index tax rolls during a 1999 data conversion was evidence that Parcel 7D had been effectively abandoned. Their lawyers argued the original deed was compromised. Harold signed for the envelope. He took it to the kitchen table. He read it once. He put it in the binder, behind the folder Garrett had left. He went to the closet and found the photographs he had taken in August 2001, the ones from the disposable camera, developed same day at the pharmacy. The timestamp on the back of each print read August 14, 2001 in the machine's faded ink. He looked at the photograph of the 1956 tax record, the original paper filing for Parcel 7D, hand-typed on county stationery, predating every digital system Meridian's lawyers had referenced. The gap they thought was their weapon had been documented before they found it. He set the photographs back in the binder. He closed it. A quiet morning, a cup of coffee going cold, a strip of nothing outside, sitting still and patient the way it had been sitting for 23 years. Then the phone rang, an unfamiliar number, area code he didn't recognize. Harold looked at it. He picked up the receiver. "I'm authorized to go to 190. That was the first thing Whitmore said. $190,000 before Harold had said a word. The lawyer's voice was careful and fast. At the same time, the voice of a man who had been told to close this and had decided that leading with the number was the cleanest way to do it. Harold said, "I heard you the first time, Mr. Whitmore." Whitmore said the company was prepared to resolve the matter quickly, cleanly, and generously. He said Meridian had no interest in a prolonged dispute. He said the legal question around the deed was a matter his team was prepared to litigate if necessary, but that they preferred not to. Harold said, "I'll be in touch." He set the phone down. He sat at the kitchen table for a moment. He looked at the binder. Then he picked up the phone again and dialed a different number. Karen answered on the second ring. He said, "I need you to come home." She drove up that Saturday. She brought a file box. Inside it were copies of every document Harold had described to her on the phone. The full permit file on the East Corridor expansion, the LLC registration records, Meridian's formal acquisition history. She spread it across the kitchen table next to Harold's notebook and the binder. She read for 2 hours without speaking. Ruth made coffee. She set a cup next to Karen without a word. She went to the living room. Karen turned to the photographs from the library, the ones with the timestamp. She held them up. She read the date on the back of the first one. She said, "You photographed these before you bought the parcel." Harold said, 3 months before. She set the photo down carefully. She said, "And they're claiming the digitization gap broke the chain of title." He said, "That's what their letter says." She looked at the photograph of the 1956 tax record. Calvin Ott, property tax paid in full, Parcel 7D, $3.12. She said, "Dad, their whole case depends on nobody having this." He said, "I know." She looked at him. She said, "How long have you known they'd come at you this way?" He said, "Since 2019 when Garrett mentioned the legal team." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I'll make the call." She called Whitmore from Harold's kitchen table on Monday morning. She identified herself, spelled her bar number, and said she was representing Harold Fenwick. She said they were prepared to respond to the abandonment claim in writing and in person. She said she had 3 documents she looked forward to presenting. Whitmore's tone shifted on the first sentence. By the third, he asked for time to consult his client. Karen said, "Of course." She hung up. She looked at Harold across the table. She said, "They'll push back." He said, "Let them." The hearing was held March 11, 2024 in a county administrative room with a long table and fluorescent lights. Meridian's team brought 2 attorneys and a paralegal. They had a 40-page brief and a presentation showing the digitization gap in the county's index tax records. Their argument was clean and well prepared. The county's own digital system showed a break in the ownership record, which under state law could support a claim of abandonment by inaction. Karen placed 3 documents on the table. First, the 1956 Calvin Ott tax filing, original paper copy, photographed on August 14, 2001, timestamp visible on every print. Second, the November 1978 easement resolution, with Parcel 7D absent from the release list. Third, 63 consecutive annual tax receipts, one for every year from 1961 through 2024, showing the county had taxed and collected on Parcel 7D without interruption, including the 2 years of the supposed gap. The county had never stopped taxing it, which meant the county had never treated it as abandoned, which meant Meridian's claim was built on a gap that only existed in a digital index, not in the actual record. Karen set the stack of receipts on the table and said, "The county collected $61 in March of this year. They cashed the check on the 15th. She sat down. The arbitrator looked at the 3 documents for 4 minutes. He said, "I don't see a gap. I see a filing error in a digital index. The paper record is continuous." Meridian's lead attorney leaned toward his associate. Then he reached for his phone. The arbitrator ruled in 11 minutes. The calls went back and forth over the following 3 weeks. Meridian wanted to buy. Harold refused. He had never wanted to sell, and he was not going to start now. Karen drafted the terms. A permanent access easement, a legal right for Meridian to use the 12-foot strip for the road extension. In exchange, Harold would receive a monthly payment of $1,100, adjusted for inflation every 5 years, transferable to his heirs upon his death, tied to the operational life of the road. The road was engineered to last a minimum of 60 years. Meridian's lawyer pushed back on the inflation clause. Karen said, "Then we're done here." He accepted the clause. He pushed back on the transferability. Karen said, "Then we're done here." He accepted the transferability. The third time he pushed back, Karen did not say anything. She looked at him. He signed on the terms as written. Karen called Harold that evening. She said, "It's done." He said, "What are the numbers?" She said, $1,100 a month, every clause. He said, "Good work." She said, "Dad." He said, "Yeah." She said, "You built a really good case." He said, "You closed it." She said, "We did." He said, "We did." He hung up. He walked to the kitchen. Ruth was at the stove. The kettle was already on. She didn't turn around. She said, "Well," he said, "it's done." She nodded once. The way she had nodded in 2001 when he'd come home with a $47 receipt in his coat pocket. She poured the water. The signing was at the county clerk's office on a Thursday morning. Harold drove himself. He parked the truck. He went inside, sat at the counter, signed his name 4 times, and received a copy of the executed easement agreement folded in thirds. He walked back to the truck. He opened the glove compartment and took out the same notebook Ruth had given him years ago. He turned to the last page with any writing on it, then turned to the blank page after that. He wrote the date, March 28, 2024. He wrote 100. In perpetuity, he capped the pen. He put the notebook back in the glove compartment. He started the truck. In the parking lot of a downtown office building, Douglas Reeve read about the easement agreement in the county recorder's bulletin. His assistant had flagged it. He read it once. He set it down. He said nothing. Across town, a few people who had been in the basement of the county administrative building on a Thursday morning in October 2001 heard about it eventually. One of them mentioned it to someone else. Another shook his head and said he had always wondered about that strip. Nobody laughed. Some men collect land. Harold Fenwick collected patience. And when the right moment finally came, 23 years later, it paid him for the rest of his life. If that had been your land, would you have taken the 190 Meridian offered on the phone? Or would you have held out for the monthly deal that pays forever? Drop your answer below. And if you've ever held something the whole world told you wasn't worth keeping, you already know what Harold knows.